Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you all here for our second Eye of Africa of the fall semester. I'm Jamie Monson. I'm the director of the African Studies Center. And today we have a very exciting presentation. Somebody who's just come back from Zimbabwe, where, as most of you know, there's been a recent election, a lot of debate about whether this is something that will change Zimbabwe or whether it's more of the same. Very happy to have Peter Penar, our own PhD recipient from Spring. Congratulations to Peter. He's now an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at MSU. And Peter's interests are in democratization in Africa. He's interested in human rights. He's interested in political transitions, so right in line with what we're going to be learning about today, election quality and human rights protections. He's also been involved with the Afrobarometer here at MSU, looking at public attitudes and also at socioeconomic development and political leadership. He's been working in 8 different African countries, and as I mentioned, he was just recently in Zimbabwe for an extended period of time, learning about the elections up close. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for that kind introduction, and thank you for coming today. I actually want to start with a bit of sights and sounds of Zimbabwe. Throughout the process and while we were there, we did some recording of some video footage, and what I'm going to show is some video footage of the campaign, some images, as well as played underneath the key campaign songs, which I'll talk about throughout the talk. The movie is about 4 minutes, so I'll start that up.
I am as soft as wool. I am a very soft person in life, my brother.
usacheuke baba namwanda ijipita usacheuke usacheuke baba namwanda kauda
anicheuke na baba namwanda kaona
wana weZimbabwe
anicheuke na baba namwanda kaona
cheuka usacheuke usacheuke baba namwanda cheuka
anicheuke na baba namwanda kaona
cheuwe
anicheuke na baba namwanda kaona
ijipita usacheuke baba namwanda
waive kufamba kwapaurosi achienda damazikosi waive kufamba kwapaurosi achienda damazikosi dzikamaria tinamati aizinguva yekutamba nayo dzikamaria tinamati.
All right, so that is a little bit of the footage of both campaigns, both the government side and the opposition side. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the campaign songs just very briefly in the talk. So the big questions that I'm going to discuss today and I'm going to answer at the end of my discussion of the election are the following. Did the 2018 elections mark a departure from severely flawed elections in Zimbabwe's past? And considering the results which we now have of the election, what are the prospects for economic rejuvenation and future international re-engagements in the next 5 years? And I want to start this talk off by providing a bit of the cast of characters involved, political figures involved, and the rest of the presentation will go through 4 acts here. And I want to begin with Robert Mugabe here. And many of you know who Robert Mugabe is. He was the longtime president of Zimbabwe and has been the leader of Zimbabwe since the independence in 1980. Down here is was the former chief general of Zimbabwe, Constantino Chiwenga. And here is the current president and at a time the vice president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is here, which I'll be talking quite a lot about him today. Up here on this side is the opposition side. We have Morgan Tsvangirai. Now, Morgan Tsvangirai was an opposition politician from the MDC, the opposition party, who had challenged Robert Mugabe in successive elections. However, just a few months before the 2018 election, he unfortunately died in mid-February. And afterwards, this figure here, who you saw in the video, Nelson Chamisa, took over the mantle of MDC and then MDC Alliance, the key opposition party in the election. So these are some of the figures who I'll be talking about throughout this talk. In particular, Emmerson Mnangagwa and Nelson Chamisa, as they would face off in this election, as you can see their images up here. So let me start with Act 1, the transition. And you saw some archival footage in the video regarding this transition. Now, the transition began as a coup or a military transition in 2017. So essentially, with the backing of the military, they brought in the former vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was essentially kicked out of ZANU-PF and left the country. The military didn't like that so much, and so they brought him back in, and we can talk about the reasons why later, and essentially you had this transition. And when Mnangagwa comes to power, one of the first things that he begins to talk about is this concept of a new dispensation. And this term new dispensation wasn't just something that elites were talking about or you hear from elites, but actually even in the smallest of villages, they would use this term new dispensation. Either they would say we're in a new dispensation, or they were concerned that we weren't really in a new dispensation, but it filtered all the way down, right? And part of this new dispensation, as the new president announced, was this re-engagement with the international community and the West in particular. And so for the first time in 15 years and 16 years for the EU, there were invitations for Western election observers to observe this process for the first time as part of this new dispensation. Now, another part of this dispensation was a bit of image cleansing for ZANU-PF and its leader, Emmerson Mnangagwa. And in this video clip,
crocodile has its roots in the revolution.
You can see this.
Crocodile is also a very patient and ruthless animal. Do those characteristics describe you, do you think? Patient and ruthless?
I am as soft as wool. I am a very soft person in life, my brother. You should understand that I'm a family person, I'm a Christian, and so on.
all right, so again, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who's known to be involved with a series of mass killings in the 1980s and engineering Robert Mugabe's violent political campaign in 2008, is rebranding himself as somebody who is peaceful, a family man, a Christian, as soft as wool in this BBC interview. And we can also see that connection of this new dispensation to the importance and the emphasis on a new democratic dispensation. And this is a poster that is on the ZANU-PF headquarters in Harare, which says, "The voice of the people is the voice of God," right? Again, emphasizing the will of the people here, this rebranding that took place. We also saw this rebranding in a variety of different ways. Again, we see this poster right here. We can see how Mnangagwa is pictured here. He looks very warm and fuzzy and very pleasant to be with, which was not his original image. And as was mentioned in the clip, his original image was that of the crocodile, right? That was his nom de guerre. And we also see this emphasis on both a vision for the future and moving Zimbabwe into the future, but also one that emphasizes his long time in government and that he will bring experience to government. And this was a pretty complicated proposition for the government to put into effect. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So there are a couple of stakes for Mnangagwa during this transition and going towards election in the pre-election phase. First, he had to really complete a leadership transition that had never taken place in the history of Zimbabwe since 1980. And he also needed to consolidate his power within ZANU-PF, which is a fairly tall order. The second thing he really needed to do was establish some sort of control over the bureaucracies and state security sector. And for those who know Zimbabwe well, you'll know that the security sector is not always homogeneous and monolithic in their alliances. And in many pockets within the CIO, which is essentially their internal security, or within the police, they had strong attachments still to Mugabe and some of his allies. So he needed to consolidate that power. And finally, with this new dispensation and this new air of democracy and that he's attempting to put forward, that meant, and inviting election observers, that meant he would have to win an election without using violence that had been used in the past. And he would have to do so with an economy that still was quite stagnant. So the point I want to emphasize here is that Mnangagwa took power and was attempting to win an election in 2008 at a time where he was quite vulnerable on many fronts, right? And ZANU-PF acknowledged many of those vulnerabilities that were present. The other thing that was a key thing to mention about Mnangagwa is that traditionally in elections he's fared pretty poorly. I think he's only won one parliamentary election himself. In other cases, he was appointed by Mugabe to be a minister in the cabinet or to various posts. And so Mnangagwa not only had these challenges, but he himself was seen as a poor electoral performer. So he would have to get through that hurdle. And so one of the parts of this getting through this hurdle was this emphasis on economic competence, all right? And I'm going to tell a little story in this regard. ZANU-PF would go to villages, a number of villages, their local political activists. They would sit people down in the village and they would say, "We've really screwed up for the last 37 years. We really did." They acknowledged it. "We used to be the breadbasket of Africa. But, you know, under this new dispensation, under our new leadership, a visionary leadership, a leadership that is also mature and has competence, we're going to be able to revive the economy." And they made that message very clearly all the way to the grassroots. So you can see some of their campaign messaging. Here is one of the candidates running for MP, Winston Chitando, which emphasizes jobs, social development, and other development projects. And he is actually now in the new cabinet the Minister of Mines, one of the key positions within the cabinet. And we also see this emphasis, again, not only about economic rejuvenation, but also it being inclusive, right? An inclusive, diverse, and dynamic Zimbabwe, which is a new message for ZANU-PF in this election. All right, so this is that transition period where we're setting things up. We see the challenges for ZANU-PF, potential challenges on the horizon. So let's go to the pre-election period. This period, months, that takes place a few months before the election, in the period in which I arrived in the country. This period was marked by, again, for the first time in a while, the inclusion of international observers. Those from the European Union were there, those from the International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, and I came to observe the election through the National Democratic Institute. So I was through that mission, which had support from USAID. We also had the Commonwealth, which had observed elections in the past there. We also had regional observers as well that are based in the continent that are observing the elections. But the key part here, and the key difference here, was the inclusion of some of these Western observers. Now, there were a number of concerns that observers had before they arrived, based on what had happened previously in the country in previous flawed elections, but also some trends that one was seeing since the November transition. The first was potential for closing of this political liberalization, and wondering whether this political liberalization, this openness, this new dispensation the president was talking about was actually going to be one that would bring about political opening. So we're wondering about that. The second thing we were wondering was the security sector involvement. Now, after the political transition where the military stepped into the politics of the country quite directly and overtly, a lot of those who were involved with the military took up cabinet posts in the actual cabinet. So the Minister of Foreign Affairs was a former military spokesman, for example. So one of the concerns was, were we going to see the militarization of institutions? And institutions being, bureaucratic institutions, but one of the key institutions for election, which is the Election Commission itself. All right? And in the intro video, you heard the song that was played while ZANU-PF, where you saw images of ZANU-PF, the ruling party, and the song is very clearly praising that the military is good, they do what is right for the country, right? And that was actually their campaign song. So they were pretty overt in this embrace of this kind of military point of view that was there. So we're wondering, is the security sector going to be involved, and if so, how much? Right? We're also concerned about this use and abuse of state resources and the fusion between the party and state and that involvement. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. And then obviously the concerns that we've seen in past elections around blatant election manipulation, changing of figures, ballot stuffing, tampering with the voters' roll, or having a very poor voters' roll. So we're still concerned with this. So let's talk about that pre-election environment. So these were some of the concerns at the beginning. What do we kind of see in a sense? Well, the first thing we can think about is that political space and political liberalization, how much political space was opened in this new dispensation. And I would argue a fair amount of political space was actually opened up for the opposition to campaign throughout the country with minimal influence. So this is a photo we took of Chamisa, the opposition leader's convoy. So we were following him between two rallies. You can see his car is here. You can see none of the cars have license plates, so technically they're driving illegally according to the laws of Zimbabwe. But again, it's kind of a sign of pushing the boundaries with the state in a sense. And you can see them traveling from one rally to the other. They got stopped by a checkpoint, and they stopped for about 2 minutes, and then they kind of continued on to their rally with no incident. So the one kind of anecdotal thing we saw was that. But in general, we saw a fairly open space for campaigning. That isn't to say that there were a number of rallies that they wanted to hold in Harare that had some complications with the dates that the government was a little resistant to assent to. We can talk about those in Q&A. But there was certainly some element of movement about the country that was increased from past elections, one could say. And you can see here one of Chamisa's campaign rallies where he was speaking. And you can also see in this image, one of the key factors is that at these rallies in general, opposition rallies, they provided their own security for their own rallies. So you can see them, one gentleman here wearing the security vest, and they're holding the line. So in theory, they were able to manage their own process without the infiltration of police. Now, we don't know whether police or security are present, because some of them are obviously in plain clothes, but in visible ways, they weren't present at some of these rallies, right? And again, we can still wonder whether they were there, but you can see they maintain their own security. But one of the major concerns when it came to the use and abuse of state resources was this uneven playing field that was present. And that came through a variety of different ways, mainly through the use of farm input distributions, the uses of schools for political rallies, and also the use of children in campaign events during school hours, right? And their teachers having them involved with those campaign processes. And in the video, you saw one of the clips of one of those seed distributions right here. So this is a bag of seeds. One of the MPs is there. And you can see the people in the village are quite happy about the distribution that was going on. But you can see that nobody's wearing campaign regalia here. So at the same time, it walks that fine line between incumbency and advantage and whether this is a campaign event. But if you watch the whole campaign event, you can see much earlier that campaign slogans are being mentioned and clearly visible. And at the end of the rally, you simply say, you know, we've done this for you in this village. How are you going to thank us? And the people will say, you know, don't worry, we know what we're going to do, right? We know we're going to vote your way, right? That's the implication here. And I'm paraphrasing from translation. And so, for example, in this example here, we see 6 lorries here. There's just 2 pictured in this picture that I grabbed, but there are actually 6 lorries this size that were delivering seeds to a community that was about 25 kilometers off the main road, so in a fairly rural area. And in fact, these large trucks couldn't even make it out to that village because the roads were too poor. And even at this rally, the MP promised to grade the roads a week before the election as well. And you can see here's images of the school. You see the school children just kind of hanging outside because the event is occurring in their school grounds. And you can see some of them are taking home the seeds. And you can see the large, and at the beginning of the video, you see the large package of seeds. So in past in distributions, usually it'd be around 4 kilograms of seeds that would be distributed. They were up to about 10 or more this time. So they were really emphasizing we're delivering them, and they were also emphasizing we're delivering them much ahead of growing season, because growing season and planting season is usually in November, right? And so the argument from the government's perspective about why they were doing this is because they wanted to make sure they got there before the first rains, right? And that happens to be before elections, right? You can take that the way you'd like. But the fact is these distributions were clearly happening at a time that they usually don't, and just before the election. And some were given and some were promised. So in some villages, they were simply taking people's names for a future distribution that may or may not actually happen after election. And again, that fine line between the incumbent advantage and abuse of state resources. Again, you can see that same distribution. Here's all the fertilizers and seed and distributions that are taking place in that village, and it's quite a lot. In this image here, you can see school children that are participating in an event that is a public-private partnership with one of the biggest sugar companies in Zimbabwe. You can see children are performing, and they're in the audience as well, again, during school hours on a weekday, that are involved in this, and in clear campaign regalia. You can see the scarf there. So there was this uneven playing field, definitely, and the use of resources on the government side, on ZANU-PF side. Now let's turn to the opposition side, MDC Alliance. What did it look like over there? And it was completely the opposite. We had a party that had hardly any resources. We had candidates who would complain about spending about $50 to print the voters' roll. In fact, they were upset they got the voters' roll on CDs because they would rather have the paper copy that they used to complain about, but now they were complaining about printing it. So there were very strong, there are financial issues on the opposition. Those financial issues were not only at the presidential level, but were also felt at the MP, those running for member of parliament, who are getting no funding from their central party. Everything was coming out of pocket, usually out of their small hustle or small business that they had to afford campaigns. So that limited their campaign ability, right? They limited them to, dressing up cars and driving around in car rallies, to holding door-to-door events where they walked through different areas, residential areas, knocking on doors, sort of, raising the noise about the campaign, or they would just wait for their candidate to come to town, as you saw in the video when the presidential candidate came, and they would all come together. But the problem with this strategy and this lack of resources is it really didn't emphasize any of their MP candidates at all. And so their MP candidates were all working on the local level, running for parliament, just hoping they would ride the coattails of Nelson Chamisa to office, right? And even at his rallies, some of the pictures that I showed in the movie, at those rallies, you'll see the MPs are given about 5 seconds on the stage where they say, this guy is running for your MP seat. He gets up there, he waves, he sits down, and that's it. He doesn't give any speeches. It's all about Chamisa, and once he's gone, the rally's over. So there was a very limited resources for Chamisa to use. So not only was Chamisa stepping into a new role as the opposition leader, as I mentioned earlier, he was also dealing with this resource disadvantage, severe resource disadvantage. When it comes to other parts of the election that I want to highlight and ways that we can kind of think about it, one of the key things that we did see, we didn't necessarily see overt violence, but there was definitely subtle intimidation. And a lot of this occurred through the politicization of traditional leaders who are very important and very influential in rural communities in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. In particular, the chief of all the chiefs, the chief president of the Chiefs Council, Chief Chirambira, was a chief who basically outwardly embraced ZANU-PF, right? He said, I support ZANU-PF. Now, according to Zimbabwe's constitution, traditional leaders are not supposed to get involved in political behaviors. They shouldn't be endorsing candidates and doing such, running for office, right? So it's unconstitutional. So they took a case to court against the chief president of the Chiefs Council, and the court says, you need to retract your statement, all right? So months before the election, at least two and a half months before the election, there's this ruling, but all throughout the process, Chief Chirambira never retracts his remarks. So that stands, and it set a line, and it sent a signal to the other traditional leaders that they could become politicized, and also those who are opposition inclined that you better kind of sail under the radar. Don't say anything. And in fact, in this meeting where we have with the Election Commission and a number of traditional leaders in a village, you find out that a lot of the traditional leaders who in the meeting said, I'm from ZANU-PF or I support ZANU-PF, secretly were MDC supporters, but couldn't say so outright. So that intimidation was both happening through chiefs, but it was also happening within their own ranks, which was a really interesting dimension. We also saw the potential reminders of past violence. So in past elections in Zimbabwe, there was terrible violence. And one of the key provinces where I was, in Mashingo provinces, was where some of the first violence took place. And so although we didn't observe this outright, people talking about there'll be violence if certain results happening, because obviously when observers are present, people change how they are going to speak about things. We did hear a lot of reports about that being, something that was being reminded. But in addition to that, we did see this mass messaging of citizens where they said, if you want a peaceful election, you're going to vote for this MP and you're going to vote for the president. And these were actually SMS messages that were tailored with constituency specific information. So to this day, we're still wondering, where did they get that information? Was it from the Election Commission? Was it from the Econet, which is their biggest mobile carrier? We're wondering. And again, that goes back to this influence of the state and the party here, perhaps. When it comes to election management, which there have been serious concerns with ZEC in the past, we definitely saw them innovating in some ways. So one of the key pieces of this innovation were these multi-party liaison committee meetings that happened on district level, provincial level, national level, to discuss issues that candidates were having with the election so they can troubleshoot the election and make some sort of remedies to them. And they worked out fairly well. At the national level, one of the key changes that happened in the election was that the ballot booth, when people were voting, was like this. Imagine you are all the election officials. The ballot booth would be right here, and I would vote like this, with you guys over my shoulder, right? That was the plan. And the justification was they wanted to make sure I wasn't doing anything funny in the ballot booth. I wasn't taking a picture of my ballot, right? But the problem is that nobody really likes it or feels safe or comfortable or private when you know that there are people standing or looking right behind you. And so this was something that the Election Commission wanted to have on Election Day, but just a week before election, in one of these multi-party liaison committee meetings at the national level, the opposition says you need to change this, and in this case, the Election Commission obliged. But not every piece of feedback was taken into account, and I can talk about that later. Another key feature of this election was tackling the issue of the voters' roll, which was always a problem. And in Zimbabwe, people don't vote based on a polling station list like you may do so in the US. You go to your polling station, you vote at your polling station. It was based at the ward level, sort of a larger level. You can vote in any polling station, and then things get collated, right? This was the first election where the voting was done at the polling station level, and was the first time where they were using a biometric voter registration and creating a new, whole new voters roll. And the hope was to, again, bring security to voters roll, make sure there aren't duplicates, double registrations, other issues that had been clearly present in past voters roll. And so this process was fairly well done, but there were some issues. One of the issues that happened was that people have to provide a proof of residence. And so, as I mentioned, the chiefs are the people who actually issue the proof of residence to rural folks. And so some chiefs were asking for money to provide the proof of residence, just a little kickback. And some chiefs were doing a political litmus test to see if you were ZANU-PF before they would give that proof of residency. And actually, the ZEC, their election commission, actually did have to go into rural communities and sensitize a lot of these traditional leaders and say, no, what you're doing is not legal. So there was a general push to improve the voters' roll. But there are a number of concerns, and there was one audit done of the voters' roll before election that raised some questions of double entries, as well as what we saw was this exclusion list, a bunch of people who are taken off the voters' roll at the last moment for a variety of reasons. And we're still kind of sorting out what that was, what that really means, why you were on this exclusion list. And a number of people on voting day we saw were actually turned away for being on this exclusion list. Again, we can talk about that later. And in general, what we saw was that, the ZEC officials at provincial and district levels were pretty transparent, which was good, particularly in the province where I was based in Mashingo. But at the national level, there were severe problems with the transparency of the process. And in particular, Priscilla Chigumba, who is the Election Commission chairwoman, who is also a judge, so you can see by her title, had a number of issues, PR issues, seemingly lacking transparency. And one of the big issues I guess I could falter with was the design of the presidential ballot paper. And I actually don't have an image of it here, but the presidential ballot paper was two columns, right, in alphabetical order. And one column had 14 candidates on the first column, right? And Chamisa is number 2 because C is, pretty high up in the alphabet. And then the next column had like 15 through 23, right? So they're unbalanced columns, right? 11 to 14, 15 to 23 on the other, right? And what you saw was, guess who was at the top of the second column, that 15 slot? None other but Emmerson Mnangagwa. And so a lot of opposition folks had a problem with the basic design of the ballot paper and the kind of signal this ballot paper sent about the primacy of the presidential candidate. Maybe his name is, last name starts with M, but somehow he's at the top of at least one of the columns, right? And I place a fair amount of fault with the Election Commission with failing to really understand why this is a very sensitive issue and sends a pretty big signal to those voters. The other thing I'll talk about, I like to mention before I give my general assessments, is women's participation. As you saw in the video, there were a lot of women who were involved in campaign events. But I would argue that's pretty much all that was their only role in this election, more or less. And you can see the Election Commission had beautiful posters emphasizing women's votes. You're 53%, I think it's even more than 53% at the end of the day in the voters' roll when it was finalized. They made up a majority of the voters' roll. They're emphasizing their vote. But in the province I was in, there was only one woman candidate from a major party, and that's 26 MPs. So it's 26 times 2 candidates of the 2 major major party. Only one was a woman, and she was running in the district of the provincial commissar. She was running against the provincial commissar for ZANU-PF. And she was a quite charismatic leader and had quite good following. She did fairly well. But mainly women's role fell to entertainment at campaign rallies, just showing up, and meetings that were such as this one. You can see the commissar for the Women's League of the province of Mashingo here was circumscribed there. So women were seen very visibly, but were not taking part in this election in terms of standing for political role in terms of in the actual election. Now, when we talk about the end of this pre-election phase and talk about the post period, before the election, Afrobarometer did 2 pre-election surveys, and Mike was a contributor to this process, an employee in Zimbabwe. And what we saw was that ZANU-PF in April or May before the election was leading MDCT, MDC Alliance, so the opposition kind of grouped together, 42 to 31% in terms of intentions. But in the second pre-election survey that was done later, you can see that a number of those whose intentions were don't know or refuse to say seem to have moved in the direction of MDC Alliance. So a lot of people are saying that this election was going to be close, and it was. If we look at other citizens' kind of perspectives during this pre-election period to round out this pre-election, we'll notice that there was a decline in those who said, and this comes from the Afrobarometer reports ahead of the election, that there was a decline in those who feared electoral violence, but the numbers were still very high, of at least 43% saying there's somewhat or a lot chance of electoral intimidation or violence. So there was a subtle decline over the pre-election period, but I want to emphasize the fact that these numbers are still very elevated. And we also see very elevated concerns with aspects of the process, that incorrect results will be announced, that security agencies won't accept the results, and that there will be violence after the election results were commenced. So Act 3, very briefly, Election Day. There's not much you can see on Election Day. That's what you realize as an observer, because a lot of the things happen during Act 2 or the pre-election period. But things were generally orderly, and I can talk more about Election Day at the end. So very quickly, the post-election, and then my closing thoughts. The post-election period was tainted by an incident that happened on August 1st, in which protesters were demanding, and I could turn this down around a little bit, where protesters were demanding the release of the results 2 days after the election. But technically, the Election Commission does have 5 days to announce the results. But in past concerns in 2008, it took 6 weeks for the Election Commission to announce results. So you can understand why those in the opposition are concerned as days mount that something is going on behind the scenes. So they took to the streets, and in response, the military was called out. That is military, not the police, and was called out to go after the protesters, of which at least 6 have been confirmed dead. There are reports there are more, but they were using live rounds and against the protesters, and this is some of the clips that were there. So at the beginning of the video, you saw everyone celebrating the military and their role of taking out Mugabe or forcing him to step down. That began to get reevaluated a bit when this incident happened, and also challenged this view that we had a new dispensation. So quickly, the results. Mnangagwa just got over this 50+1 threshold that was needed to avoid a runoff election at 50.8. In fact, myself and my partner who observed the election, we got the closest. My partner thought it was going to be 51%, and I said it was going to be 50 plus a few votes for Mnangagwa. So we both thought this was going to be close looking at Afrobarometer, but we knew we weren't going to be kind of lucky in the sense to have a front row seat in tremendous history of power transition in Zimbabwe. We also knew we were probably not going to have that opportunity to see that. And you can see on the MP side, you can see it may have been close in presidential side, but the ZANU-PF wiped the board really at the parliamentary level. And again, that resource gap was really felt on the MP level. And then we can see people that were voting in a sense for ZANU-PF on the MP side, but actually voting for Chamisa for president. And sometimes at some districts it would be a 2,000 vote difference. So the last thing before my thoughts is that one of the questions that the opposition had was to petition or not. And so ZEC announces the results about a day and a half after the protests happened. So they announced them slightly early at 1 a.m. on television. Everyone's staying up, and Mnangagwa is declared the winner. And they decide that they want to take their case to court. And what I've heard is that they didn't really want to take their case to court. They actually wanted to have political protests and put political pressure as opposed to going the kind of the legal court route. But the incident that happened on August 1st was the issue that made them concerned for the safety of some of their supporters. So again, we have this liberalization that took place, but we see this space seemingly closing a bit when we look at it. And then at the end of the day, the case is taken, and then 14 days later, the Chief Justice rules on the case and basically says, based on the numbers and the evidence on numbers, we don't have a reason to, in a sense, validate the petition, right? And we can talk about that later. So in conclusion, the good. This was the first election without Mugabe on the ballot since independence, so we have a political transition at place. There was a slight opening of political space, and there were some modest improvements, I think, to election management. The voters' roll was definitely improved from the past, but I don't want to say that it was perfect, right? It certainly was not. The BVR process was fairly well done. And there was more or less, it was more or less peaceful without overt violence until the incident that involved the military, which I just mentioned, which is still important. The bad. There was this clear fusion of state and party, and the inability for the awareness of that to translate into any sanctioning or regulation of the flow of resources. Second, they substituted violence for acute forms of resource distribution. And then also there was relying on the past memory of violence in the country and conjuring that up. The opposition was severely weakened through their resource disadvantage. And I think one of the key things to mention about this when we go going forward is there was very little jurisprudence that was actually being developed during this election that can actually promote better practices, right? Regulation of financial resources, the use of children in campaign rallies. There wasn't good jurisprudence that was actually can be used for future elections. So as I close very briefly, now ZANU-PF has to deliver on its promises, right? And I said at the beginning that they had this economic competency argument, and they barely won at the presidential level. They did well at the MP level. And you can see already we have some signs of concerns. These are bond notes. They're pseudo currency that I picked up on the black market in sequential order, brand new, right after election. And reflecting that printing of money that happened before elections is the actual black market rate. Where I got there was about 1 to 1.25 in Harare. It went by election time to 1.4. Then afterwards, I'm hearing that it's already up to 2 rate. So you exchange $100, you get 200 bond notes, right? It should be 1 to 1. That's in theory. It's a 1 to 1. So we already see concerns there. We also may see some concerns that this new dispensation, may or may not be taking hold. And you can see Mnangagwa's he wrote an editorial just after he was inaugurated in The Guardian saying that the thing that he really wants in Zimbabwe is a really strong opposition, right? And this is an excerpt from that editorial that appeared very widely just a week and a half ago. So again, he's still talking the line of this new dispensation, though narrowly winning the election. But the question is, what will this hold, right? And we can see that there may be concerns with that. And I end with stepping back from Zimbabwe just a bit and thinking about Southern Africa and the liberation countries overall, too, in this perspective and connecting it to economic logic. All of the liberation parties, as of today, have now undergone at least one leadership transition. Zimbabwe was near the last. Before that, Angola with Dos Santos in Angola. So now we have new presidents in all of the liberation countries, right? And the other key feature of this transition, I think, is that the new justification for these liberation parties is less on an ideational side, less ideological, and more about economic performance. In South Africa, we see that with the change of the guard from Jacob Zuma to Cyril Ramaphosa. We also saw that from Robert Mugabe to Mnangagwa. Now, that is an interesting turn of events in Southern Africa and for liberation parties, but it also raises the stakes for these liberation parties in the sense that they now have to perform for the people, because they've now made this discourse very clear and open. And so the one thing that we'll be looking at in debriefing this election and what happens afterwards is, are they able to perform well? And if they don't perform well, will this election look as open or will be as open or increasingly open as it was in the past? And that's the one thing we'll be looking for is that. And so thank you for your time, your attention, and now I open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for a very stimulating presentation. I'm sure that many people have questions. We do pass the microphone. It's not to make your voice louder. It's so that your voice will be heard on the live stream. So please do use this, and Shingi will be passing it around. If you have a question, try to keep it short. Because we have a lot of people in the room, I'm guessing we'll have lots of people who want to contribute to the conversation.
Thank you for that presentation. I just have a couple of I guess, constitutional questions about how Zimbabwean government works. So I was under the impression that there were seats reserved in Parliament for women.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'd like to see, like, I don't even know how that process works constitutionally. I mean, are these just lists that the party puts forward? And then also, you know, in South Africa, you have which is what I'm more familiar with, you have a degree of federalism at the provincial level. So I don't even know whether, off the top of my head, provincial elections went on at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are several provinces, and certainly the cities, that Chamisa won. And, you know, it's interesting in South Africa with the DA in the Western Cape, it sort of proved to be a mixed blessing, because on the one hand, the DA controls the Western Cape, and they're able to sort of bolster their claim to having executive experience, whereas at the same time it means they're also able to get, you know, involved in scandals, as they absolutely have done over the past year. So what's the prospect of, I guess, any kind of foothold for the MDC in terms of resource distribution before they would theoretically, you know, take control of Parliament and the national government itself?
Great, thanks. Both great questions. Yes, there is a proportional distribution of seats that go reserved to women in the new constitution, and I believe after the end of this election, that clause sunsets. So there are certain provisions in the Zimbabwean constitution that have certain time horizons on there to, you know, for such that the Constitution can kind of transform the politics. That's a theory behind it. And so there are women in the parliament now, but they many of them came through a party list and a proportional distribution of those seats. So that's how that works. On the issue of devolution and decentralization, Zimbabwe is certainly not decentralized at all. These provinces do not have their own provincial legislatures like you may have in other countries or states. They're very much centralized. And in fact, a key component of that centralization is the fact that the federal government works through what is called these district administrators, who are appointed by by the central government, the executive, and the minister of local government administers that. And all the resource distribution usually flows through the DA, these district administrators, and the DA usually actually farms their roles out in rural areas to the traditional leaders to distribute, right? And so the DA, the district administrators, and the traditional leaders are generally, in cahoots with one another when it comes to these resource distributions, the seed distributions that are present. So there certainly isn't any sort of decentralization and no elections that are on the provincial level, such that MDC Alliance really can't get a foothold in any area and kind of send a signal that they're competent and doing things right in, say, Harare. And that's one of the key concerns that they have of really building the party, particularly outside of their urban area. The one thing I will note to that is that one of the campaign promises that Mnangagwa had was that he was going to bring about devolution. He kept saying it over and over again. But to this day, I don't know what that means, right? And he wasn't very clear about what that meant. Does that mean a provincial legislature, or, you select your DA? I don't see it happening. So I don't know whether that promise was just a holding out of hope of more local control, or whether he'll actually go in that direction. But we'll see. That's one of the promises he emphasized. So we'll see.
So what parts of the country experienced the most ticket splitting?
So I wouldn't say that there was. I wouldn't say there were ticket splitting. Well, there was ticket splitting in the sense that it was happening, in the vote totals. You can tell it, but obviously you didn't have situations where, Mnangagwa lost and the ZANU-PF won, right? You didn't have so much of that, the actual outcome. But within the vote totals, you saw these percentage swings. So some of the big areas in which that happened were in Mashingo province in the south, where I was based. And one of the key areas was in Manicaland. And if I move back to the results, so it's easier for us to see. So I was down here in Mashingo, which generally voted ZANU-PF, but there were a lot more votes for Chamisa than there were, there were more from Chamisa, and then the ZANU-PF also soaked up some of that. But the key one was in Manicaland to some degree. They were very shocked about how poorly Mnangagwa was doing in comparison to some of the MPs. So one of the biggest ministers, Patrick Chinamasa and others, and some of those who are in the cabinet, come from Manicaland. So the hope was that those ministers would rally the votes for the president, but they really didn't. And so right now, because that ticket splitting in a sense happened to a large degree in Manicaland, there has been some rumors of potential by-elections. A number of those MPs have not been given cabinet positions, as in a sense as a punishment. And so this kind of signals this accountability mechanism within the party that is now being used. And also displays a larger issue with ZANU-PF, is that still the party is really concerned with power politics inside of itself, loyalty, and kind of this cohesion, maybe more so than some of these immediate development concerns. So I would say a big chunk of that ticket splitting happened in Manicaland. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have just a couple questions. My first question is, what was the role of the youth in the promotion and activities of the election? And did you feel that Chamisa's campaign related more to the youth initiatives because of his age? And how would you describe Harare, and what contributed to MDC having more votes than the ZANU-PF? And you spoke briefly about the Western Observer, and I wonder if you can kind of discuss a little bit more about the intricacy of the Western Observer due to the kind of like devil's advocate that the Western Observer has played over the years in Africa's history.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. All three good points. Starting off with the youth, I could talk forever on this, but shortly, as you can see from the images of Nelson Chamisa, he is young. I believe he's just 40 years old, so that's I think the minimal age for a presidential candidate. So he's just there. So he's on the young side, and I think the AU definition of youth is still 35, but he's definitely on the younger end. And yes, and the youth were very much energized in Harare by the campaign and in different areas. But at the same time, as the youth were energized, they don't always show up to vote, as they do in many countries. They don't register to vote. And so we were talking to our provincial ZEC provincial chairperson in Mashingo, and he wasn't surprised going into the election that Mnangagwa wouldn't lose the election, because we looked at the registration results from Harare, and the numbers were not there in terms of the registration figures. They just were not there. And when you actually look at the results from Harare, you see about 500,000, I believe, off the top of my head, maybe more, going to MDC, and about 200-some thousand going to ZANU-PF. That margin in Harare is not good enough, and that turnout's not good enough. So as much as there are many youth that are really excited about MDC Alliance, for example, they're not turning out. They're not playing that kind of role in the political process, right? But it is to say that, as much as Zimbabwe is a young country and is very youthful, areas in the rural areas, the faithful people in the rural areas, older voters, they turn out to vote. And they know how to turn out that's turnout. And so some of that influence can be diluted. In terms of candidates, again, like you mentioned Chamisa's age, there were a number of I would say, green candidates, younger candidates who were running in this election. And particularly in Mashingo, you had those in their 40s that were running. What we could say is this generation 40. So you did see more younger people getting into the process. But when you look at the minister list of the current president and how things are figuring out, you're realizing that the old guard is still, very ever present. But Nelson Chamisa, I will say, was promoting a number of more youth candidates within the party. So we'll see how that goes and whether that process can be sustained. When it comes to the observers and their influence, I mean, obviously international observers are not supposed to intervene in the affairs of elections. So I guess their one weapon against election malpractice would be their words and their statements. So they're not monitoring the election. They don't tell people how to do things, even if things are going wrong. And I think they contributed pretty positively in this case, because I think they were very clear about the standards for the election. And if you read the statement from the mission that I was a part of, as well as I think the EU statement as well, I think they were pretty even-handed about giving credit where there was definite improvements from past, but also really emphasizing, again, that unlevel playing field that was present. So I think it was a really even-handed approach. And I think more than anything, one could say about observers, particularly from the EU point of view, is that many of them really do want to get back into Zimbabwe to some degree. They want a re-engagement. And so I think even from their point of view, there's kind of a good faith effort to engage Zimbabwe, at least in my opinion.
Thank you, Peter. Very interesting. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about inter-party democracy. So something historically that has been a problem in Zimbabwe is high levels of violence during nomination processes. And it seems like this was the case in this election too. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about what are the sources of this high level of conflict within the parties?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. So one anecdote in this regard, when we first got to Zimbabwe, one of the first things ZANU-PF was saying, another thing they were saying to their grassroots was, we know that our nomination process was terrible, and we know some of you are angry right now, but we want you to know we're now a unified party. We've come to a conclusion of who our candidates are, and we're moving forward, right? So the first thing we heard when we got on the ground was this. So we're wondering, what happened, right? Why is ZANU-PF and also MDC having these concerns? And I think one of the key things with ZANU-PF in this election comes back to the transition of the party itself, right? And one of the major factions within Mugabe's, that was backing Mugabe and Grace, his wife, was this G40 faction that was sort of supposedly the youth, but it was more of, the old guard who are using the youth and mobilizing youth to their own ends. They were kind of taking over power within the party. And obviously Mnangagwa, allied with the military, was the one to kind of oust those G40 folks. But they still had a lot of support on the grassroots level. They were pretty popular, a number of them. And so they didn't feel that they needed to necessarily stand down from the party, or they were going to try to attempt to challenge the party in other ways. So one of the things that you had was this kind of party cleansing at the local level, at the primary level within ZANU-PF. So a lot of that happened. And so some of those G40 people lost in primaries again, so they tried to use all their local support, but ZANU-PF from Central kind of came down on them. Then they came over and they started engaging with MDC Alliance and saying, if we include, me in this alliance, then maybe I can bring some of my support. And so what happened on this side, the MDC Alliance side, was that you had a number of candidates who ran in primaries. The primaries were terrible. So one of the issues here was just the management of primaries is terrible, such that when they ran primary elections, they would literally pull you off the street and say, you want to vote in my primary election? Come, I'm just going to take you and you'll vote, right? So there was this concern. And so at the end of the day, after a flawed process, particularly in MDC Alliance, this flawed process, you had candidates who lost primaries or lost these flawed primaries who said, I'm not gonna stand down. I'm gonna take the party logo, I'm gonna take the party name, and I'm just gonna run anyway. And so in Mashingo, where I was, there were a number of districts where there were double candidates. In fact, in the movie, you had this guy, Stanley Temba, with his sign. He was one of two candidates in Cherezi in one of the southern constituencies. And on the ZANU-PF side in Cherezi as well, you had ZANU-PF people who lost the primaries, who couldn't get into who didn't want to get into MDC or couldn't get MDC. Then they ran as independents themselves. And so you had this proliferation of candidates at the MP level. So again, going back to the answer to this question, there was this internal dynamic within the party. There was this kind of alliance politics playing out. And then there was the fact that these primary elections are fairly illegitimate when they come to thinking about them as electoral exercises. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Peter, for your presentation. My question is, what has been the impact of social media on Zimbabwean politics? Because it seems this time around it was a different, there were different dynamics altogether. We were also able to follow ever since the new dispensation until now. But what has been the impact on both the urban voter and the rural voter as well?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And as you mentioned, Nolene, there's been this proliferation of social media, and it's definitely influenced the electoral environment and the news that's coming around. I want to start off maybe answering this in a more critical fashion, right? One of the things you would notice from those, particularly those who are in MDC Alliance going towards elections, they would send you a lot of WhatsApp messages, or they would show you their phone and say, this is what is going on, right? One of the images was of people leaving a ZANU-PF rally like they're running. You may have seen this one. So it seemed like people were running away from the rally, and the military's on the kind of on the edge, kind of trying to slow people down. And the whole reason this was going around was to say, nobody wants to attend a ZANU-PF rally. You're just forced to rallies, and they want to get out. They want to flee, right? And when you think about it and you talk to people who are actually there, they didn't see these kind of things happening, right? And you can make any kind of situation look the way you want to. It could be the end of the rally and everyone's leaving. Or when we were at one of Chimisa's rally, there was a torrential downpour, and everyone started running to seek cover. And I would joke, I said, if you film this the right way, you can say everyone is here trying to leave a Nelson Chamisa rally, right? So there was a lot of rumors and unconfirmed things going around, right? And we saw it all. We saw forms, their election forms, their V11s where the election was reported, where numbers were not included on them, whereas you know that they are, right? And obviously a quick Photoshop job, you can do that. And so one of the things that's good about social media is that it is spreading the news. It is allowing for people to solve collection action problems and come together to communicate one another and push forward some political agendas and support one another. But it has led to a proliferation of misinformation that is concerning, and that feeds into other sources of misinformation in say, government media and other things that is out there. So one of the things that I emphasize with people when I was in the field is always take what you say with a grain of salt, right? Check it with credible media sources and other places. And so this is one of the things we'll be trying to figure out, right? Even this issue of how many people died in the military crackdown after the election, there are different numbers, right? Government says, I think, 6. I've heard reports that are higher, and I've seen pictures of many bodies that total more than 6. But we wonder whether they're true or not, all right? Again, we have to be, very careful when we're making pronouncements. And definitely for election observers, from their perspective, they have to be very careful about verifying everything that we see. We saw a lot of rumors flying around, but some things were quite true and were important to be disseminated too.
Thank you, Peter, for the brilliant presentation. I want to follow up on Tiffany's question really quickly. So when you talked about the observers, you mentioned the EU and then the mission that you were with. But I'm curious about the AU's mission, and if you observed any significant difference between their observation and the observation of the missions that came from outside of Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Eben. Very good question. So, as many of you know, a lot of my own research and my dissertation work was dealing with this question of what are the regional observers saying, and what the differences are between different observer groups, and what the implications are. So, well, that was one of the things I was really interested in seeing as being part of this mission is, first, how was the AU and some of these African regional observers really interacting with the process, right? What we found is that the AU and SADC's capacity was very limited to actually observe this election, right? And the one example I'll give, the observers who are supposed to be in our province as long-term observers came only a few weeks before the election, and their job was to cover not only Mashingo, but also Manicaland province, which is a major province, and during the election process, they only spent one night in Mashingo province, and they were attempting to see one of Chamisa's rally. They came too late in the day to view it. They held one meeting. They left the day after. So in a sense, they were never really seen in our province. SADC was Southern African Development Community observers were present a bit more in the province. In Mashingo, they had their own long-term observation mission and some STOs that were there. So they were more present than the AU was present in this election. A lot of their statements in general, so that's the issue of coverage and what they may or may not have seen in the election. In terms of their statements, they were a bit more conciliatory and supportive of the election process and a little less critical than the EU and the mission that I was, the sort of the US NGO mission. They did emphasize some of the issues of uneven playing field, but they kind of downplayed that. They emphasized, obviously, the fact that this was like the most peaceful election Zimbabwe's had in very long. Also, an election that was quite competitive. And one thing to point out that I really didn't in the talk is that Chamisa got 44% of the vote after taking reins of a political party only about 6 months after the death of Morgan Tsvangirai. So, you know, that's pretty good for such a quick candidacy. And they emphasize things like this. So the statements were generally more conciliatory, and I know some people were a bit frustrated that they didn't take a hard tact, but you can understand their perspective, their geopolitical perspective, their interest perspective in Zimbabwe, and the fact that, you know, they really care about those elections being peaceful as they haven't been in the past, right? And so perhaps they'll be more critical in the future, or perhaps Zimbabwe will just settle at the status quo in terms of election quality. We'll have to see.
I'm just going to ask real quick then, a month or so before the election, there was a bombing, if you will, at one of Mnangagwa's rallies, which is, you know, unprecedented, you know, for you know, with the way the security teams around Mugabe have been, and seem as if it's a lot of the same apparatus still at play. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about what was that about, and what's been the backlash or outcome thereof?
I think that's a good question. I left that out in the discussion of events for time reasons. But yes, as you mentioned, and then this was actually the day after I got deployed, and people that we were involved with were actually at that rally, but they had left just before the incident. But just to recap, at the end of one of Mnangagwa's presidential rallies in Matabeleland in Bulawayo, there was a grenade or a bomb that exploded near the stage. So if this is the stage, it happened on this side right after he had left. Some people got injured, but none of the major kind of officials of ZANU-PF got injured. And it happened. And there was a concern about what happened in the fallout, and the president and Emmerson Mnangagwa visited hospital, you know, the hospital of some of the people who were hurt, and vowed to kind of investigate, but we haven't heard anything to date. And it's one of these, I think this goes down as one of these potential mysteries of what is there. There are a variety of things one could say about it, right? One is perhaps there were elements within the security sector that in fact did want to assassinate Mnangagwa. They wanted him out of the way, right? As I mentioned at the outset, the CIO, which is the intelligence service, was quite divided on Mnangagwa, also within the police ranks as well. So maybe they were trying to assassinate it. Or maybe, not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, this was an element to show a you know, you explode a bomb, you show that the president's under threat, and then he would be able to show his magnanimity to show that he would not crack down or lessen political space, after the bombing. Because one of the things that I was waiting for was this going to change the posture of the security forces after this bombing? Because one would expect stepped up security. What happened in Zimbabwe? Nothing. No increased security, at least visible security on the streets, unlike in the post-election phase. So there was really no response. So why? Why wasn't there any response if he was really concerned about being assassinated? Again, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but we can wonder. And again, we won't know. I think this goes down, at least for now, as one of the mysteries of the election. But it allowed Mnangagwa again to cement that image that he was going to be, soft. He was going to approach it with rational calmness, and he did that. And that was his kind of play on what happened there.
I think I can just. Sorry. Go ahead, Gunn.
Yeah. So I was going to ask a question about the local observer. You did allude to their capacity to cover election to observe elections. So I said that they are based on the capacity. So what does that really mean? And the second, was it financially, occasion, or what factor actually explains their inability to actually do proper coverage? Then the other thing is about the perception about their viewpoint, about how they look at. You said that you were not actually critical. And so I was looking at it from this perspective. Could that be they looking at the issue from the perspective that Westerns observers from the Western world are more likely to say that the electoral processes in Africa are not fair. And from their own perspective, it might be like they have this notion that really allows us to monitor, observe elections in the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be that they just want to project like a positive image that Western observers are more likely to report, and they feel that they want to get this into the narrative that the electoral processes in Africa they actually involved in positive things that happen compared to those who are more likely to emphasize the negative part of it.
Mm-hmm.
The dynamics at all?
Yeah, so I guess my response, I'll start with the second part. One is I think in many African countries there are some severe flaws, right? I think there are real flaws here that are being pointed out, right? And that's not to say that there are serious flaws with how democracy and elections work in the US, right? And if you look at observers who have been sent to the US, the OECE has observers that have been sent to the US who in some cases confronted people who didn't even want them to observe, and also wrote reports that were quite critical of disenfranchisement of millions of Americans in election processes. You also see international observers being quite critical here, as they should be, and I think that's fair, right? So I guess that's my kind of short answer to that part. The first part was the domestic observers, local observers. So in general, there is an umbrella group called ZESNI, the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network, that covers the whole country. Their theory is to have stationary observers in every polling station in the country. I was one who observed and was one of the most critical of ZESNI's ability and what they did on election day. I think they tried. But when we look at Mashingo province in the sample I was able to see, there were a number of what I would like to call dead zones in which there were no domestic observers, and in some cases dead zone where there were no observers for the opposition parties present, because there was a really problematic and poor preparation for party agents this go around. And when it came to ZESNI, I think they were well coached from those who are involved, those who are in the organization at the provincial and national level. I think they really cared and they wanted to observe, but the resources weren't there, and the recruitment efforts were hard to recruit observers in each polling station. So for example, in Mashingo, there was one area that's a resettlement area, an area where the land has been redistributed to people, and so is generally favorable to ZANU-PF, and ZANU-PF really kind of has their hooks in those areas. In one of those areas, there wasn't even an opposition candidate who was running in that area. So we forget about opposition party agents really covering. You have to rely on the national party to do that. And then the question is, can you actually recruit some local observers from that area who are willing to say that they're local observers and really monitor those polls? It's going to be very hard. And so you could see those who are involved in the ZESI mission. You could see all the polling stations and all the areas and all the names that were filled in, and then also all the blanks in which they weren't there. So some of it may have been financial, but some of it is recruitment, and some of still the fears of intimidation that are present that are there, as well as financial aspects.
Thanks so much, Peter. I think I'll take the privilege as chair of asking the last question, and I'm going back to something Tiffany asked, maybe ask it in a different way. It's so striking, as we see in many African countries, I think, the difference between the urban vote and the rural vote. And if I'm remembering, Shingi was sharing with us that after the election, there were some kind of disagreements where rural voters felt like they were being accused of not knowing what they were doing, or not being really thoughtful voters. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that rural-urban divide in Zimbabwe as you understand it.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest divides. You look at this map, you see Harare up here, you see Bulawayo here, and you see the red for the opposition, right? You see the urban areas that are there. In Mashingo province, ZANU-PF did very well, but they did pick off one of the seats this time, which was Mashingo urban, so they got the urban seat there. So you see this urban-rural divide, and there was definitely this discourse amongst a lot of people, particularly those in MDC, and this was going around on WhatsApp as well, that there should be two governments. One government for the urban people and one government for y'all in the rural areas, right? They were even talking very vocally about this, and this kind of frustration of why aren't these rural people being so intransigent of kind of opening up to another opportunity. And I think one of the couple things to point out. One is I think there's almost different cultures or ethoses between the two parties. When you go to a ZANU-PF rally, one of the first things they'll say is, in a rural area, is that they'll say, "Thank you so much for coming. You folks are 80% of Zimbabwe's economy. You are the real Zimbabwe, right? You are the ones, the agricultural producers." They speak, and the way they conduct rallies, they speak to the rural population. They interact with them in this way, right? In a way that MDC has found it a bit hard to communicate. And so in one ways, these voters are responding to this different, sort of different ethos of the parties to some degree. That's there. The second thing is there are real political interests that are shaping people's political behavior in rural areas. I talked about resettlement areas. People in resettlement areas, some of them are very grateful for the land redistribution that has taken place, or if they're fearing intimidation, they're afraid that if their party gets voted out of power, or ZANU-PF leaves power, that they could take the land back. So there are these fears, and they're very much rational. They're not coming from a point of view that they lack literacy or lack understanding of the political process. And one of the things that you realize about Zimbabwe, and hopefully my Zimbabwean friends can attest, is that Zimbabweans are very smart, intellectual people, right? They have some of the highest literacy rates in Africa. And that filters, and although education has taken a hit in recent years, the education system has definitely taken a hit in certain years, there is this tradition of education and an emphasis on it, even in rural areas as well. And so I don't think it's that issue. I think it's what the parties are speaking to, the interests that are there, and also the last thing I'll say is in the past, certain rural areas and certain communities have been no-go areas for the opposition. So there's still time for the opposition to begin engaging some of these voters in ways that they haven't in the past. And we'll see. Will this new dispensation open up some of those avenues for engagement or not? And I think that's one of the big questions, and what will that mean for the rural-urban gap?
Well, thank you so much for a very interesting discussion, great questions, great answers. I think we've learned a lot.